I'm Justin Briley, guest hosting this week's edition of the show. My guest today is Ashley Lande, author of the brand new book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics and Jesus Christ. Ashley is an artist and writer whose journey of faith involved a long period trying to find meaning and transcendence through drug-induced psychedelic experiences. But when the trips turned sour, she went on a journey that led from getting high to discovering the Most High, Jesus, the true source of transcendence and meaning. Ashley, welcome along.
Thank you so much.
It's great to be talking to you again. Before we jump into your backstory, this is an amazing book. So much that I want to cover in the short time we've got. But can you recall the first time that you tripped on psychedelic drugs and what you remember about that experience?
Sure. So the very first time would have been my senior year in college. I had a friend who had some psilocybin mushrooms, and I really didn't know much about psychedelics, much of anything about psychedelics. I remember that I decided to get dressed up in hippie garb, which I thought was appropriate for tripping. And it was more of just a good time. We blended up the mushrooms in a blender with orange juice, and there were four of us, and we each drank a portion, and we just had a good time. We stayed in our apartment for the most part. We went outside a little bit, and like I said, it wasn't a revelatory experience. There wasn't really a spiritual dimension to it so much for me at that point. But I did think that it was really fun and magical, and I immediately wanted to do it again.
I mean, what was happening in that moment and future kind of experiences that you continue to have? Probably hard to put into language, though you do a great job in the book. What were some of the kind of ways in which it hit you when you went on these trips?
I just thought it was so interesting that it was outside of any kind of consciousness that I had ever experienced. At that point, I was a pretty hardline atheist. And so, like I said, even though that first trip wasn't necessarily spiritual, there was an aspect of the transcendent to it. There were lots of visual distortions, lots of auditory distortions. And I just thought they were beautiful and interesting. As you said, I'm an artist, so I just found that really intriguing. And I was really attracted to experiencing something that was outside of normal waking consciousness. I just thought it was intriguing and fascinating, and I wanted more of it.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about in the book how you'd sort of had a sort of nominal kind of church experience growing up, but you'd kind of decided it wasn't true. You'd been quite influenced actually by some of the new atheist writings, especially Christopher Hitchens. So when you came to this, you kind of were, I don't know whether willingly or not, but you'd kind of resigned yourself to the fact that this is a world without any ultimate meaning or purpose, I suppose. So tell us about sort of that journey and why, I guess, the psychedelic experiences started to change that.
Yeah, I was raised in a Methodist church, and looking back, there are things I'm grateful about it now for. Methodists are very good at grace and loving people, and so I am grateful that I had some kind of a foundation, but it wasn't I wouldn't say it was a very strong foundation. Being Methodist was kind of a tradition in my mother's family, and so I feel like it was based a little more in tradition. My dad was very conservative, and so he never liked the Methodist church, but he would allow himself to be dragged along, a couple Sundays a month. And I don't remember really reading the Bible or really like knowing what was even in the Bible, aside from some Sunday school lessons about Noah's Ark. And I don't remember necessarily praying together. And I don't mean this as an indictment against my parents. I think they were just doing the best they could with what they were raised with. And so when I was, I think about 14, it was just very easy because I had never genuinely had faith. It was pretty easy for me to scandalize my parents by declaring that I was an atheist, And I got into reading different things at that time, like the beat poets, Jack Kerouac, things like that. And so the underground, or the counterculture just seemed appealing
Mm,
and cool.
mm, mm,
And I was I was a very arrogant teenager, and it just seemed fascinating and interesting to pursue something, outside of what I had been raised with, which, as I said, seemed very hollow and shallow to me. And I think I discovered Christopher Hitchens maybe when I was in college, and he just seemed very intelligent and clever to me, very witty, and just really, really appealed to me. So I think I tried to read some Dawkins, and I read a little bit of Sam Harris. The Dawkins, the science was over my head. That was over my strongest subject. But I really loved Christopher Hitchens. And
mm,
I think looking back, I think the hard certainty of particularly the New Atheist really appealed to me. Like I said, as a very arrogant teenager, just that hard certainty really appealed to me. And I guess I'd say the rebelliousness of being an
mm,
atheist appealed to me at that time.
mm,
So,
mm.
yeah.
What led you then sort of in the direction in the end of these psychedelic experiences and sort of looking into taking mushrooms, acid, LSD, and so on?
Uh, I think at that point, near the end of my college experience, I was burnt out on alcohol, which had been a big part of the circle I ran in. Just getting drunk, I was really burnt out on that, and so I was just kind of open to whatever, And part of being open to whatever is I didn't necessarily have any um, moral boundaries or limitations like that, and so I was just, yeah, more or less open to anything. And so when my friend said he had psilocybin mushrooms, I thought, well, why not? As I said, I didn't have experience with or much knowledge about psychedelics. I don't even know that I had the awareness that you could have a bad experience, you could have a negative experience. I thought it was just more or less like any other drug. And
Mm,
so, as I said, after that first psilocybin experience, I certainly wanted more.
mm. Yeah. So and you did you came back for more. I guess I guess you found in it something that you hadn't been able to experience before. That with these revelatory experiences and I guess at one level that did switch you on to the idea of transcendence, the spiritual. I think you kind of started to get interested in what you might call new age kind of ways of looking at life, spirituality, and so on. What how did you kind of change in terms of your view of life, the spirituality, the supernatural, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I did. I mean, on one hand, I look back and see the the winding path that God took me through, and I think, well, psychedelics were, in a sense, the first step on I guess, my journey from becoming such like a crusty atheist at the age of 21 to being open to spirituality. And I look at that in terms of, I look at that now though through the lens of Romans 8:28, that God works all things for good, um, is for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And it did open me up to the idea of the transcendent realm, the idea of spirituality. But the irony was that I became open to anything except for Christianity. Like I literally, like I talked about that moral boundlessness that I had embraced before through reading, people like the Beat Poets, reading existentialists and nihilists, and that kind of turned into like spiritual boundarylessness, except for Jesus. I didn't want to hear about Jesus if
Mm.
anybody talks about Jesus. But yeah, I started reading different things, just different things from the 60s. So my first it was probably, gosh, 6 months to a year after that first psilocybin trip that I had my first LSD trip. And that was actually not what I would call a fun experience at all. It was devastating in many ways. It was, gosh, how can I describe it? It was existentially and spiritually shattering. um, but I just immediately immediately wanted more of that. Like I was seeking, in the end, I can see like I was seeking something outside of myself. Like I knew that that hard certainty of new atheism, the idea of this like closed dome of a world where there's nothing penetrating from the outside, there's no transcendence, there's no supernatural, it had become unsatisfying. And even that hard certainty of it and lack of mystery had
Mm,
become
mm,
unsatisfying.
mm. I mean, just take us through a little more of what you experienced as you went on this. You became, I mean, you don't get addicted, I'm guessing, to psychedelics in the way, say, a heroin addict does, but I'm guessing there's is
Sure.
something addictive about the experience, about kind of living in that world and that mode. So you were
Yeah.
kind of, you were doing this on a very regular basis, occasionally saying, well,
Mhm.
you know, when you did have a bad trip, you know, I'll only do this occasionally, but you found yourself
Yeah.
going back to it before too long. So what was it like kind of living in that kind of haze, if you like, that sort of world, if you like, of these experiences? What was it you were pursuing and experiencing?
Yeah. So after that first LSD trip, that, like I said, was rather devastating and very, it shook me deeply. I remember thinking, I don't know if I'll ever do that again. And then I think it was 2 weeks later that I was starting to call around and look for LSD. So I got to the point where I was doing it by myself, probably at least once, if not twice a week. And I became increasingly disconnected with reality and the world around me. And I think what in my head I was pursuing, and when I look back on my writings from that time, which are strange to read, but I was pursuing some omega point of spiritual enlightenment. And I felt like I was being spurred on by something. I look back at it now, I think it was a spirit or demon, but I just felt so compelled. I felt like it's just around the next corner, like
Mm,
this elusive point of enlightenment. And the irony, of course, was that it kept shrinking away from me and receding into the horizon as I was pursuing it. But yeah, I really felt like I was on this epic cosmic journey and I was going to reach ultimately this point that I sought. I didn't know what it was. It got to the point where I almost couldn't perceive, like, or I almost didn't care if I lived or died. I
mm,
just wanted to be absorbed into the all, or be
mm,
absorbed into, I think it's
mm.
fascinating. Alan Watts, he's someone that I read a lot of back then. He was kind of a 60s countercultural guru, of, I guess you could call psychedelic spirituality, kind of
Kind
Buddhism
of a
light.
Timothy O'Leary kind of character of,
Yes.
and yeah, in that way.
Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. Ram Dass. Yeah. Those people. And he taught things of this nature, like, are the boundaries of our body are an illusion. We're just part of the all in all, like I am part of the sun is part of me, like this boundarylessness of personality, boundarylessness of the individual, that the individual is an illusion. And I read his biography written by one of his children, and they said he was also an alcoholic, and was very troubled. It's very sad, but on his deathbed, he said, something like, one of his children said, "Don't you want to live? Like, why are you destroying yourself through alcohol? Don't you want to live?" And he said something like, it's not worth fighting for. It's not worth living for." And I don't, that's not verbatim, but it was something of that nature. There's just this totally
mm,
defeated, almost nihilistic statement. And I look back and I think, that was where I was heading with, I feel like that is the logical, outworking of that
mm,
worldview,
mm,
that
mm,
ultimately, well, nothing really matters if I'm just part of the all in all, and we just get, absorbed back. And there was also some Hinduism light in there as well. Like
mm,
everything is
mm,
just cyclical. We're constantly getting absorbed back into the wall and getting spit out again, as some reincarnated being. And then we have to go through the cycle of karma again. And yeah, when I look back at where I was psychologically, it was rather scary. It was like I no longer valued my life. I no longer valued living. but I really believed, as I said, I really believed that I was on this journey
Mm,
of cosmic proportions. And
mm,
it
mm.
was very, it, on one hand, it was extremely consequential, but on the other hand, it was of no consequence at all because it
Yeah,
didn't really
yeah.
matter. Yeah.
I mean, and that sense of kind of being enveloped by the oneness and everything
Yeah.
being meaningful but meaningless at the same time and so on. I guess that is tied to what the trip often induces in people. I've often heard of people talking about sort of, this ego death and, being enveloped by the kind of oneness of everything, as though you kind of lose your own self in the process. So you must have experienced, did you experience something like that? Was that where that kind of sense was coming from, that really it's all about this kind of ego death and so on?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. I experienced the so-called ego death many times. I mean, that becomes kind of a pursuit, I guess, or a goal of tripping. And it's interesting because at first it can feel supremely liberating. It can feel like all of your preconceptions about, well, and it's also very destabilizing because it can feel like all of your preconceptions about life and what reality is have just completely been obliterated and swept away by this cosmic tide of I don't know what you call it, nothingness and beingness, like two sides of the same coin. And it can feel very, very liberating to people. But like I said, ultimately for me, after a time, it became, um, I don't know if I would say like a prison, or it just
Mm.
led to nihilism, which I feel like is just the logical outworking of that kind of thinking. And so yeah, I experienced that many times, and I think I almost got to the point where I felt like I remember I don't know where I picked this phrase up. My earth trip is what I called having to function in reality, having to have a job, having to brush my teeth. I called my earth trip. And I got to the point where I was like, I don't want to be on my earth trip anymore.
Mm,
I just want to
mm,
be
mm.
absorbed in this other world.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah.
And that kind of dual kind of life almost that you were living in, this kind of
Yeah.
cosmic adventure versus the very mundane, kind of challenges of normal life, you spell out
Mm,
so well in the story. I guess what's interesting to me is kind of now your reflections, and we'll come to, how you became a Christian in due course, but looking back on that, do you think of those as spiritual experiences or just chemical experiences?
mm,
Because you do obviously talk at one point in the book about kind of being very aware, especially on one sort of in between trips, you had a kind of experience, which for you write, I remember the night I finally saw him, the devil, Papa
yeah.
Diabolus. Um,
Yeah.
so it sounds like you do think there was a spiritual thing going on there, even if you were
Mhm.
tapping into something that was potentially quite dangerous.
Yes, I definitely did. And I still do. And I think it's interesting that I had this almost like a pet name for the devil. And in my mind, there was this cosmic war going on between good and evil, whatever I perceived to be good, that I was enmeshed in. And yeah, that night really shook me up because I was not on drugs that night. And I was lying in my bed and I saw an apparition in the corner of my room. It was just like a dark column of smoke that was kind of swirling around, but it was substantial. And I thought to myself, okay, that's not really there. I'm just going to go back to sleep. My drug-addled brain is just producing this apparition that's not really there, which is interesting. As much as I was enmeshed in this world, and I loved it in a way, like I couldn't really handle the idea that I was having visual hallucinations while I was not on drugs. So I told myself it's
Mm.
not real. And then I had this little terrier mix, and he stood up and he bristled and he started barking straight at it. And we were I was on the second floor of an apartment, so it's not like there was it was in the middle of the night. It's not like there was someone walking by. There wasn't any noise from the apartments above me or below me. and that that really freaked me out.
Mm.
But I absolutely think there is a spiritual reality to it. It's not just chemicals, assailing our brains. Although I think the fact that there is a chemical reality to it does not negate the spiritual reality.
Mm. Mm.
But
Mm.
and I do think that makes it really dangerous, because I feel like people always get more than they've bargained for, that these drugs are taking us places that we're not intended to go to, at least not in our, fallen state. No, we're
Mm.
not.
Mm.
So yeah, I absolutely think that they were real spiritual experiences in a sense.
I mean, those who do vouch for these experiences, obviously you're not one of them now, Ashley, but
Mhm.
those who do kind of pursue enlightenment, transcendence through this route, what do they think is happening? Because obviously there is a chemical component to it, so
Right.
something's happening in the brain. What do they claim is happening? As is it some kind of breaking down of some barrier that is normally there? What is the claim of what's happening when it comes to the practitioners of this?
I've heard different theories, yeah, that it does like disable, that it somehow taps into our, it's serotonergic. Psychedelics are serotonergic, so somehow they break down our normal meaning making filter, I guess, that they do in some sense sweep away our previous ways of like understanding and filtering concepts and reality. And of course, I think about that and think like, are those really meant to be broken down in such a violent, sudden manner?
Mm.
And I would really question that. And I think for those who believe that there's a genuine spiritual component, I think that they would probably believe that um, they're pulling back the veil on reality. That this idea of like oneness and everything being one and everything being connected is the ultimate reality. And to be fair, some
Mm.
people do experience, and I experience at times, a feeling of oceanic love. But I, even those experiences of oceanic love, I look back and I feel like there was always um, an edge of how can I describe it? An edge of danger to them, or like an edge of a lack of safety, of a lack of like
Mm.
complete reassurance and
Mm.
rest, and even in
Mm.
those feelings of
Mm.
oceanic love. And I compare that, of course, to my experiences as a Christian of experiencing the presence of Jesus Christ. And there's the word I've used before, which it sounds a little strange, but it feels to me the appropriate word. There's a cleanness and a purity to the
Mm.
experiences of the
Mm.
presence of Jesus Christ that there never was to even the most,
Mm.
bombastic, oceanic
Mm.
experience of universal love that I would have experienced in psychedelics.
Yeah. So tell us about how things progressed to the point where I think you started to become somewhat jaded with these experiences. You were pursuing transcendence, but I think the returns were becoming less and less. You were getting more bad trips over good trips, and obviously it was dominating your life to some extent. You ended up meeting your now husband and having your first child. How did that impact, the journey as you went forward?
um, Profoundly. So my husband and I met at our acid dealer's house. So he was just as into acid as I was. And there's this dictum that floats around the psychedelic world. I still hear it today. I was just listening to a podcast interview a friend sent me yesterday. The title of the podcast was "Psychedelics Saved My Life." And this woman used this language. She said, um, that the medicine only ever gives you what you need. And so that's a really interesting aspect of the whole psychedelic world. There's almost this deification, and I experienced that too, like this deification of the drugs as kind of this God, this beneficent God that will only give
Mm.
you what you
Mm.
need, and that will only give you, what's going to make you grow and going to make you progress. And so I genuinely believe that. And there's also, you might hear people say there's really no such thing as a bad trip, because every trip is giving you what you need, whether you realize it or not, whether the experience itself is positive or not. And so there was absolutely vanishing returns, I guess you could call them. And I started, like I said, my first LSD trip could almost qualify as a bad trip, but I was not hindered by that. And so I did start having some really catastrophically bad trips, almost trips that were, I would say, traumatic, and that it took me a few weeks to really ground myself back in reality from, at which then those points I was thankful for my earth trip for reality. And of course, in the annals of acid lore, you'll hear, there are many people that never came back from, famous people that never came back from acid. Peter Green, who was with Fleetwood Mac, Syd Barrett from Pink Floyd. There are many cases of these people that didn't really ever, Rocky Erickson, many people that didn't ever fully come back. And that's another interesting aspect. Sorry, that's another story. I need to focus on the question you asked.
No, it's fine. Well, but
yeah.
I mean, just while we're on this like rabbit trail, these are brilliantly talented artists at one level who were obviously hugely influenced, as were the Beatles and everyone else, by psychedelia and so on. So a lot of it is baptized with a kind of romanticism, the whole thing, in many people's minds, and obviously people kind of assume it's one of those things that goes with being an artist.
Yeah. I've thought a lot about that too. And on one hand, you have these prominent examples like the Beatles, who claimed that their creativity was fueled by acid. But then if you start getting into the more obscure bands that were quote unquote acid rock, like a lot of it just isn't any good, like a lot of it is just not good at all. And I would argue the Beatles were already immensely talented, but you look at like the path that they took, and how their relationships started breaking down, which again, you can necessarily attribute that all to psychedelics, but and there was kind of this, implosion of the Beatles, and the ways, like I said, the ways that their relationships break down. But then another really prominent example is Brian Wilson. Like, he has said in interviews that he thinks LSD is a really bad drug and that he doesn't think anyone should ever take it. And he did have pre-existing mental illness before he took it. I remember I need to look this up to see. I was thinking about this the other day to verify this, but someone told me that the first time he took acid, he laid on a bed and cried for 6 hours and then got up and wrote California Girls, which doesn't sound true at all. But he was, but he was really like broken after, and he did have some things, like he had a manager who was abusing him, but he was really, really kind of psychologically broken by using psychedelics. So that's another example that people don't really talk about. And I feel like we have kind of lost the cultural lore of so-called acid casualties. And it's interesting. Before I was on Unbelievable with you, I intentionally sought out as many old hippies that had turned Christian as I could. And I talked to, probably between 10 and 15 people like that. And every single one of them, without exception, every single one of them knew at least one or two people who had not come back psychologically from psychedelic use. And I thought that was really interesting. And I feel like now that we're experiencing this resurgence in use, I feel like we've kind of, people will say, oh, it was just like Nixon and the war on drugs. That's what, these bureaucratic killjoys, that's why everything got shut down. But no, it's like they really did damage a lot of people, and a lot of people really didn't come back. And I feel like we've kind of lost that cultural knowledge.
Yeah. I want to come back to talking about the resurgence, the modern resurgence of interest in psychedelics and all the claims around, the health benefits and so on. And about people who, whose own Christian faith has kind of gone on a similar trajectory to yours, but maybe in the 60s and 70s. But let's kind of come back to your own story. because, as you said, LSD kind of was functioning sort of in the place of God for you. You actually write, LSD was not just a person to me, it was a God, the
Yeah.
thing that would make everything okay forever.
Yeah.
So tell us about the journey of how LSD got replaced by Jesus. What was the kind of the trajectory you went on? I know this is a long story and I'm asking you to do it
Yeah.
in a fairly short way, but what happened next in your journey?
Um, it is a long story, and I was definitely kicking against the goats for a very long time, and kind of in a way dragged kicking and screaming to the foot of the cross. But I had so we had our first child, and I think that really made me start thinking about the logical outworkings of the philosophies that I was embracing. We had a friend who gave us a children's book that was expressing in a very fundamental childlike way these different ideas about, and it said, I remember this book, it said like I am every person I meet. I am the puppy across the street. And I really started thinking about that. And to hear it expressed, not being couched in this like eloquent philosophical language, the way that someone like Alan Watts could do it, and to hear it just expressed in this really childlike tone, it seemed sinister. And especially when I looked at my own child and thought, like, I don't want him to just be reabsorbed into the all and have no retention of his individual himness, because he was so precious to me. And so that really made me start kind of second guessing the philosophies and new age beliefs that I had been embracing. And another big part of it was I had a friend, a childhood friend who I kind of reconnected with, and she had remained a Christian through high school, college. And I remember thinking the first email I got back from her, I thought it was awfully hokey. She was talking about God did this and God did that and God, and I was like, okay, whatever. And but we reconnected, and since we both had children now, we started having some play dates here and there. And I remember when I was with her, often I would go off on a tear about whatever um, random new age idea that I was exploring at the moment. And she would always just very gently counter what I was saying. She would say, well, the Bible says this, this is what the Bible says. And I would just kind of inwardly roll my eyes and move on. But I think that really had an effect on me looking back. And she and her husband had a little precious 2-year-old girl named Joella. And all of a sudden she started getting sick. She was running a fever for a couple weeks, and she ended up getting diagnosed with leukemia. And it was only 3 weeks from diagnosis to her passing. And just horribly tragic, devastating event. And I remember going to her funeral service and and I was also newly pregnant at the time with my daughter, and just feeling like, just so like this event doesn't, I can't find a way to shoehorn this into my philosophies. Like I can't believe that Joella has been reabsorbed into the all, I don't have a way to fit this. Like my worldview does not have a place for this level of tragedy and this level of sadness and this level of suffering. And it also really affected, and so that was, kind of shook me up. And it was also very moving to see Carrie and her husband not be completely destroyed. Like I think now of those contrasting pairs of adjectives that Paul uses in 2 Corinthians 4, like struck down but not destroyed. And so that really had an effect on me, because I thought, if this happened to me, I would be just utterly annihilated. I don't know what I would do. And so those two things together really, and it was almost like I almost felt like Carrie was comforting me at her own child's funeral. And I think that really had an effect on me, that I can't handle this, but for some reason there is something that is sustaining her that can. Yeah.
So this obviously had quite a profound impact on you, this
Mm-hmm.
friendship and example in
Yeah.
tragic circumstances. Obviously, you got to the point of actually trying church again with your
Yeah.
husband. Kind of
Yeah.
what fueled that particular decision?
So he started getting interested in Christianity. He had been seeing a psychologist for a season, and because he was just feeling like he was having trouble controlling his anger generally, and the psychologist challenged him to quit smoking weed every day and to try going to church. And so he rose to the challenge, and and it's interesting, my husband will even say now he never really had a bad trip, like a really bad trip. He never had one. But I think he also was getting to a point of being just feeling burnt out on psychedelics and what they had to offer him. Like he felt like the well had run dry, and he was looking for something more. And so he started attending a Christian church near where we lived. And I said, no, absolutely not. I am not going to a Christian church. Like I said, I was kicking against the goats for a long time. And it's interesting, like I was at a point of spiritual despair and desperation. And yet I still resisted so hard. And I think it was in my 8th month of pregnancy with my daughter, I finally agreed to go to a church service with him. And I remember I I just started weeping during I insisted that we sit near the back, you know, and I was thinking like I might be here, but I'm not one of these people. Like I'm not really participating in this. And I just like the emotion overcame me and I started weeping during the worship, and I was, you know, it was befuddling because I thought, why do I don't even know what these lyrics mean. I didn't understand if someone had tried to explain to me what Jesus did for I didn't even know what it meant. It was so foreign to me. Despite having grown up with some of that container and some of that terminology, I just didn't understand it. But I just found myself overcome with emotion. But even after that, it was somewhat easy to rationalize and say like, well, I'm pregnant, you know, I'm hormonal. But I did agree to keep going with him. And after we had our daughter, I remember the people at that church were so kind to us. You know, they brought us food. They came and visited us, and I was really touched by that. That's something that I had not ever experienced in the New Age psychedelic community. Which, I mean, you'll find plenty of nice, generous people, but there just isn't that tight knit sense of community in place, and that sense of love and service. I had never experienced that before in any community, new age, yoga, psychedelic that I had been in. And so that really had an effect on me.
Yeah. So this was all, I suppose, breaking down some of the barriers and preconceptions. I guess, was there a point at which you recognized that what you were looking for on the psychedelics wasn't going to be found there? And what was the point at which you realized actually the thing you were looking for was in the last place you expected it? You know, this
Hmm.
story of Jesus and so on.
Yeah. So I remember I had an experience, and the timeline is kind of murky to me. I can't remember if this is when I was pregnant or I remember I was sitting on our front porch, and I just felt a voice say to me, it's time to quit LSD. Like it's time to give up LSD. It's time to stop. And I remember I started weeping because the thought that just naturally occurred to me was, but LSD is my friend. Like LSD is my teacher. LSD is my
Mm.
God. I don't know that I thought it in those exact terms at the time, but LSD was my God. That was I didn't trust my God, certainly not anymore, but LSD was certainly my God. And I knew the voice, and I recognize it now as the voice of God. Like I know, um, even then I knew it was right and it was true. But like I said, I was still kicking against the goads, and I thought,
Mm.
then I got it in my head like, well, maybe the problem is that LSD is a chemical. Like LSD is a chemical. It's made in a laboratory. And maybe the problem is that I need to turn to natural psychedelics again. And I had, even in the course of LSD was my favorite psychedelic. It was the one that I would choose to do if it was at all available. But I had here and there, over the intervening years, had some psilocybin trips and had tried salvia. And I always came back to LSD because it was my favorite. But I thought, okay, I need to go back to natural, quote unquote, plant medicines, which is a term you'll hear a lot in the psychedelic world. And so I decided I was going to grow my own mushrooms. And my husband was able to get some spores from someone he knew. And so I undertook, with vigor, I undertook this process of of growing mushrooms. And it took, I can't remember how long it took, several weeks anyway, a couple months. And I thought, I prayed over this. I don't know what my prayers would have been, some kind of Sanskrit thing I learned from yoga. But I prayed over them, and I thought, I am infusing them with the right energy, and therefore I'm going to have a good trip. Like, this is going to be a great experience. I'm infusing them with good vibes. And I remember finally the harvest came, and my husband and I, we arranged for babysitting for our kids, at my parents' house. Sorry to my mom. And we took the mushrooms, and as soon as they started coming on, and I remember it was really strong, I just had this feeling like, oh no, just this sinking feeling of like, here we go again. It's the same place, the same rut in the road, the same, like it is, I'm going downhill. It's a bad trip again. And I remember just laying on the floor. I lay down on the floor, and I said to my husband, like, I really am dying this time. Like, I'm dying. I'm dying this time. And I said, does anything mean anything? And he said, yes, everything has meaning. And I started crying. And that trip was, it was up and down and up and down and all over the place. And I remember at one point I felt like I was chasing after God. I was pacing around our house, and I felt like I was chasing after God, and I just kept missing him. And there was such a sorrowful, like his robes were whisking around the corner, and there was such a sorrowful feeling in it. And there was a sorrow for me too. And like, this didn't work. My foolproof plan, it didn't work. And I was devastated, but I was also, after that, I was fully ready to move on. And I just knew that it was over.
And as you left that world behind, how did you find it, your way to embracing Christian faith? I guess this was all still very new to you.
Yeah.
There was a lot you had to kind of shed in order to step into something new.
Yeah, for sure. I think at first too, like I said, I was at a place of spiritual desperation. So I did, after that experience of first attending a church, and then especially after that mushroom trip, I started thinking, like, maybe there is something to this Jesus person. Maybe I should give him a try. And I think at first though, I was still thinking like, okay, like, this is Christianity is a lens through which I can understand this perennial philosophy. Like, it is not the reality itself, but it's a lens through which it can be filtered. And it was really profound for me when I realized, like, oh no, like, the claim here is that Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Like, the claim here is like, this is not another in the grab bag of, different religions that I can kind of pick and choose from. Like, the claim here is like, the Trinity is the ground of reality. Like, the Trinity has always existed, will always exist. Like, it is, Jesus is how we know what love is at all. And that was really, uh, yeah, I feel like profound isn't even a strong enough word because for so long I had just had this kind of bespoke pick and choose religion where it was like whatever suited me at the time, and just realizing like, no, this is not subject to me. I am subject to Christ. Like I am subject to God.
Mm.
And that was really, really profound. And I also remember Carrie, my friend who had lost her daughter, she shared a hymn with me, It Is Well With My Soul, obviously a very well-known hymn. I don't think I had ever heard it before, though. And she said that it really ministered to them while they were grieving Joella. And at least in the, the most intense period, the aftermath, I don't think you ever stopped grieving a child, but just in the intense aftermath of her death, it had really ministered to them. And so I put it on a playlist and kind of forgot about it. And there was one spring afternoon, I was playing outside with my children on the porch, and that song, I had that playlist on, that song came on. And and I hadn't really even been listening to the music up until that point. And there was something that just grabbed me and captured my attention. And I started really listening to what it was saying. And all of a sudden, I just felt like something clicked into place as far as understanding what Jesus had
Mm.
done and what Jesus had done for me. And also like the weight of my sin, that he completely took it away. And I also fully understood for the first time the weight of my sin. There's this idea in the New Age world that we've all just been damaged by life and reality. A yoga teacher I had would compare it. She would say we're all born like this perfect, pristine crystal, and then we get damaged and we get fingerprints and dirt on us from all the people that handled us. And I remember really thinking about that and thinking like, well, but like, where does the dirt come from? Like, it has to come from somewhere, like if
Mm.
we're all
Mm.
pristine
Mm.
crystals and then we get damaged, like where did the damage, there has to be some kind of genesis of the damage that can occur. And so that didn't really make sense to me. And there's this idea too in the New Age world that you can reach this enlightenment point of wholeness and perfect integrity and where you won't be damaged and broken anymore. And also like that damage and brokenness, like it isn't really your fault. Like I mean, I could go on forever about all the wacky ideas
Mm.
out in the
Mm.
New Age
Mm.
world. That you have to work with your shadow side, and your shadow side isn't really bad. But anyway, I think it was that day sitting on the porch. It was just so profound for me to. It was like I could acknowledge like that. Yes, I am foundationally broken in some way. I am sinful, and reality is too. Like I didn't have to keep pretending
Mm.
that um, that I just needed to do more yoga poses or meditate more or whatever to reach this point of wholeness that I could feel deep down inside was not attainable. So, and it was also a profound relief to realize that not only was did I not have to save myself through yoga, through meditation, through doing psychedelics, that I literally could not save myself. Like it was
Mm.
not possible. I utterly
Mm.
needed Jesus. And so that night when my husband got home from work, we still had some new age kish floating around our house, like and religious icons from Hinduism and Buddhism. And I remember when he got home that night, I said, all this needs to go. I'm done with all of it. And I didn't know how he would react to that. And he just said, yes, yeah, you're right. It does need to go. And
Wow.
so,
Wow.
yeah, we put it all in a trash bag and got
It's,
rid of it.
there's much more that could be added to this story,
Yeah.
but I will let people go to the book to read more. By the way, the book is really worth getting hold of. The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever: Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. Just as we start to round out the interview, though, Ashley, I guess you're an example of a generation that is searching for meaning and purpose and
Mm.
transcendence. I feel myself like actually that promise of the new atheist utopia of science and reason hasn't materialized for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And even, a well-known new atheist like Sam Harris has really gone back to trying to find, people's sense of transcendent through meditation. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
he and others, Joe Rogan and others, have started to popularize, the possibility that this might be the way in, a chemical way of finding
Yeah.
transcendence through
Yeah.
psychedelic drugs and so on. There's been this, as you say, this new popularity there. What do you think of that? Because I guess in a way, a lot of people see it as a kind of, it's a shortcut to this sense of meaning and purpose and transcendence. You at one time certainly, I guess, felt like that.
Mm.
So I guess what's your worry about it being kind of used in that way?
That it's really not that. I think I certainly believed it was that, but it really wasn't. And I feel like people almost always get more than they bargain for with psychedelics, and people can be seriously damaged. I feel like at best it's a dead end, and at worst at worst it's people are seriously psychologically damaged from it, or it becomes an idol that's very hard to let go of. And it's really interesting that you mentioned Joe Rogan, because I don't know if you've seen the clip floating around of him talking to, I think, Aaron Rodgers, who is also a huge proponent of psychedelics. He used to be the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers here in the US. And there's this clip I saw of Joe Rogan saying that he thinks what we need right now is Jesus. And if Jesus wanted to come back now, that would be great.
Unfortunately, the problem with living in a secular society and living in a society that has a lot of people that are atheists, that have no belief system at all, is you find a belief system. And that's a lot of these people that call themselves atheists, or they've subscribed to the religion of woke. Their God is equity and inclusiveness. Their God is this ideology that they think that you have to subscribe to. And that's why it's spooky, because human beings seem to have a very strong desire for some sort of order and form and some sort of pattern that they can follow that seems to be the right way to go. And they can be led by cults, they can be led by groups of people, they can be led by intolerant governments and evil armies and corrupt politicians. They can be led. But I think as time rolls on, people are going to understand the need to have some sort of divine structure to things, some sort of belief in the sanctity of love and of truth. And a lot of that comes from religion. A lot of people's moral compass and the guidelines that they've used to follow to live a just and righteous life has come from religion. And unfortunately, a lot of very intelligent people, they dismiss all of the positive aspects of religion because they think that the stories are mere superstitious fairy tales, that they have no place in this modern world, and we're inherently good and your ethics are based on your own moral compass and we all have one. And that's not necessarily true. We need Jesus. I think, for real. Like, if he came back now, it'd be great. Like, Jesus, if you're thinking about coming back
right now,
now's a good time.
Yeah, pretty soon. Yeah,
now's a good time.
Well, there's a lot of people that think that might be coming.
Well, it might be.
Mark of the beast. If there is the Christianity part and Jesus wants to come back and save everything,
it'd be good right around now.
Yeah.
Like, don't wait till the election.
And I was really startled by it. And I thought that was really fascinating, because I don't listen to a lot of Joe Rogan because he loves the F word, and my kids are always with me because we homeschool. And even when they're in the other room, they have very big ears. So, but I've seen things here and there. And I know in the past he was more into atheism, and had his different kind of shallow new atheist talking points. But he is really good at, I've often thought, like, a good interviewer, like Oprah, like, he's not afraid to sound kind of silly sometimes, with the questions he asks. And, but yeah, I just thought that was really fascinating. And Sam Harris, it's interesting to me that he has taken psychedelics, and it was interesting to me back in the day that he had taken psychedelics and yet was still a hard new atheist. So, it's interesting. I think the famous people who are promoting it, I think that's really dangerous, honestly. Like, I think because they're hugely influential. Someone like Joe Rogan is hugely influential. But anyway, I guess I was encouraged by seeing that, and I thought it was very fascinating.
obviously you feel anyone who goes down that route is going to go down a dead end, like the one you found yourself stuck in, the rut. But I guess what it does show is that people are still looking, and I guess they're looking in the wrong place. What I suppose, as we start to close this out, what can the church learn, I suppose? Because I sometimes wonder whether the Western Protestant Christianity sometimes can maybe feel a bit too rational or tame or theoretical. People are looking for something, exciting, a kind of an experience. I guess there are dangers in that, but I don't know. Do you feel like, how can the church kind of, in a positive way, engage with the fact that evidently there is still this great hunger among people when it comes to, looking into spiritual matters, transcendence, psychedelics, and so on?
Yeah, for sure. And I think there is part of me that's very much attracted to charismatic Christianity because it is more enchanted, and it does acknowledge more that there is a spiritual realm and that there is spiritual warfare. And I think that there are branches of Christianity that, like you said, are too rational and are too quick to dismiss supernatural experiences, and are too quick to say things like, well, emotional experiences don't really matter. What matters is the word of God, which I absolutely agree with that on some level, but I don't think that's to completely discount supernatural experiences or to discount emotional experiences of the presence of God. And so I'm really hopeful because, like you said, I think people are looking. I think people are burnt out on new atheism and the hard certainty of it. I think people are looking for mystery and enchantment. I mean, I think we all in our heart, like we want an experience of the presence of God. We want a transcendent experience. And I'm hopeful that there will be like there was in the 60s with the Jesus people, like this great harvest of people for whom the promises of psychedelics did not deliver, who will be looking for capital T truth, Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, and the life. And so I think I've been saying, like, I think it's really important for church people who may have never apostatized, and may have never left and who don't have any familiarity with drug experiences to not completely delegitimize those experiences or to say like, oh, well, it was completely hallucinatory. There was no spiritual element to it, because I really think that there is. But, I just, like I said, I'm really hopeful. And I think the church should be ready to lovingly receive those people, and also to recognize maybe that they won't, that they'll come along slowly. Like I said, when I first became a Christian, like the language that I wasn't speaking Christianese yet, like my language was still couched in all these new age terms that I was kind of trying to apply to Christianity, because that was what I had understood for so long. And so, I feel, I don't know, I feel apprehensive, I guess, about, because like I said, I feel like there will be, and even what's his name? Matthew, one of the head leaders under Roland Griffiths of the Johns Hopkins studies, like he freely admits, I've heard him admit in podcasts, there will be casualties. And that I'm apprehensive about that, and I'm sad about that. But I think that there will also be many people who get burned out on psychedelics and are looking for truth. And I think the church should be ready to receive them.
Well, I'm glad that you found your home and are able to be a guide for those who are perhaps, looking to reach out to people, but also people who maybe are walking a similar path to you, Ashley. It's been fascinating hearing your story. Thank you so much for guiding us through it. If you're watching, listening, please do get hold of this new book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, Transcendence, Psychedelics, and Jesus Christ. This is pre-order, so we're getting in there really early with this interview with Ashley. We want to have you back on the show at some point, Ashley, once the book is fully available and everything. But I really appreciate you kind of giving us an early peek at the book and your own story. It's been absolutely fascinating to read. So we'll make sure there are links to where people can pre-order the book.
Thank you so much.
For now, thank you so much for being with me and my guest on the Maybe God podcast.
Thank you.